My parents called me the black sheep for caring about money while praising my pure-hearted sister. What they didn't know was that for 8 years, I had been secretly funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars into their failing restaurant through fake contracts and shell companies. When I finally stopped their mysterious blessings, the entire family empire crumbled, and my mother was shocked. What money? Where did it go? But the way I discovered they truly felt about me will leave you speechless. But before I tell you this story, subscribe to our channel now so you don't miss any of the incredible stories we share here. Have you subscribed yet? Thank you for being part of our community. I've always believed that family businesses are built on love, tradition, and shared dreams. For 25 years, I watched my parents pour their hearts into Casa Rodriguez, our family restaurant in Denver's historic Highland neighborhood. What I didn't realize until much later was that I had been pouring something else into it, my entire financial future. My name is Elena Rodriguez. I'm 40 years old, and I'm an architect who specializes in historic restoration. For the past 8 years, I've been secretly funding my family's dream while being treated like the black sheep who only cares about money. The irony wasn't lost on me, but the pain certainly was. Every month, I would create fake consulting contracts, anonymous investor agreements, and convenient, lucky breaks that kept Casa Rodriguez afloat. My parents never questioned their sudden good fortune. They were too busy praising my younger sister Victoria for her artistic soul and pure heart. Meanwhile, I was the daughter who had lost her way by choosing a practical career over following my passions. The restaurant sat on a corner lot that had been gentrifying rapidly, and property values were skyrocketing. My architectural firm had actually been hired to restore several buildings in the area, which gave me the perfect cover for my elaborate financial charade. I would submit invoices for consulting services that never happened, arrange for anonymous benefactors to pay overdue bills, and even had my business partner create shell companies that would mysteriously order large catering events. The money flowed from my personal savings, my business profits, and sometimes even my retirement fund. I told myself it was temporary, that eventually the restaurant would find its footing, that my parents would finally see my worth. But deep down, I knew I was buying something that couldn't be purchased: their love and respect. Every fake contract I created felt like another brick in the wall I was building between my authentic self and the daughter they wanted me to be. Victoria, on the other hand, had never worked a real job in her life. At 35, she still lived in the converted apartment above the restaurant, creating art that never sold and writing poetry that no one read. But in my parents' eyes, she was the success story. She was following her dreams, staying true to her artistic vision, remaining connected to her cultural roots. I was the sellout who had traded family values for corporate success. When she would drift downstairs during busy dinner rushes to help by rearranging the art on the walls or reading her latest poem to confused customers, my parents would beam with pride. Victoria has such a gift," they would say to anyone who would listen. "She sees the world differently, with such beautiful eyes." The fact that those beautiful eyes had never seen a paycheck seemed irrelevant to everyone but me. The weight of this double life was crushing me slowly, like a building settling on a faulty foundation. During family dinners, I would sit quietly while they discussed the restaurant's latest stroke of luck: a mysterious investor who had paid for new kitchen equipment, an anonymous donor who had covered 3 months of rent, a government grant that had mysteriously appeared just when they needed it most. My parents would look heavenward and thank God for their blessings, while Victoria would nod sagely and talk about the universe rewarding good energy. I wanted to scream that the universe had nothing to do with it, that their blessings had a name, a social security number, and a rapidly depleting bank account. But every time I opened my mouth to tell the truth, I would catch sight of their genuine happiness and close it again. How could I shatter their pride by revealing that their success was built on my charity? My friends in the architecture world couldn't understand why I was always broke despite running a successful firm. They would invite me to expensive dinners or weekend trips to Aspen, and I would make excuses about being busy with projects. The truth was, I couldn't afford their lifestyle because I was funding someone else's dreams. My own dreams of expanding my business, buying a house in Cherry Creek, or even taking a real vacation had been put on indefinite hold. I lived in a modest apartment in Capitol Hill, drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic, and shopped at discount stores while my family dined on premium ingredients that I was secretly paying for. The cognitive dissonance was eating me alive, but I couldn't seem to break the cycle. The restaurant industry is notoriously difficult, and Casa Rodriguez should have failed multiple times over the years. The location was expensive, the competition was fierce, and my parents, while passionate cooks, were terrible business managers. They would order too much expensive wine that would go bad, hire too many servers during slow seasons, and refuse to raise prices even when their costs were skyrocketing. Every month brought a new crisis that would mysteriously resolve itself through my behind-the-scenes financial engineering. I had become an expert at crisis management, insurance claims, and creative accounting. My real job as an architect had become secondary to my secret career as the family's financial guardian angel. What hurt the most wasn't the money. I was successful enough that I could technically afford to support them, even if it meant sacrificing my own financial security. What hurt was the complete lack of recognition for who I really was. In their minds, I was the daughter who had abandoned her Mexican heritage for American materialism, who cared more about building designs than family traditions, who spoke English better than Spanish and wore business suits instead of flowing skirts. They saw my success as a betrayal of our culture rather than an achievement worth celebrating. The fact that this supposed sellout was the only reason their beloved family business still existed was a truth too uncomfortable for anyone to acknowledge. Chapter 2. The Breaking Point. The 25th anniversary celebration of Casa Rodriguez was supposed to be the crowning achievement of my parents' American dream. The entire Highland community was invited, along with extended family who had flown in from all over the country. I had, of course, secretly funded the entire celebration, the mariachi band, the premium liquor, the professional photography, even the custom anniversary banner that hung proudly across the restaurant's facade. As I watched my parents greet their guests with glowing pride, I felt a familiar mixture of satisfaction and resentment. They deserved this moment of triumph, but I deserved some recognition for making it possible. Instead, I was treated like any other guest, expected to smile and applaud while others received credit for my sacrifices. Victoria had spent weeks preparing a special art installation for the anniversary, a series of paintings depicting the restaurant's history and the family's journey from Mexico to Colorado. The paintings were amateur at best, but they were prominently displayed throughout the dining room like precious artifacts in a museum. Guests fawned over her talent and vision, while she graciously accepted their praise with the kind of humble confidence that only comes from a lifetime of unearned adoration. I found myself studying her work, trying to understand what everyone else saw that I was missing. The brushwork was sloppy, the perspective was off, and the color choices were garish. But somehow, in my parents' eyes, these paintings represented everything good and pure about our family legacy. I had positioned myself near the kitchen door, partly to help with logistics and partly to avoid the crowds of well-wishers who would inevitably ask me why I wasn't married yet, or when I was going to give my parents grandchildren. From this vantage point, I could overhear conversations happening in different parts of the restaurant. Most were the usual party chatter, compliments about the food, stories about the neighborhood's evolution, predictions about the restaurant's bright future. But then I heard my parents' voices coming from the back office, where they were taking a break from hosting duties. What I heard next would change everything between us forever. "I just wish Elena could be more like Victoria," my mother was saying to someone. I later learned it was my father's sister, Aunt Rosa, who had never liked me. Victoria has such a pure heart, such a connection to what really matters in life. Elena, she's always been so focused on money, so disconnected from family values. I worry that all that education just taught her to look down on us simple people. The words hit me like a physical blow, but I couldn't walk away. I needed to hear more, to understand how they really saw me. She's successful, yes, my father added. But what good is success if it comes at the cost of your soul? Victoria may not have money, but she has something Elena lost a long time ago. She has heart. Aunt Rosa, never one to miss an opportunity for gossip, pressed them for more details. But Elena seems to be doing well for herself. That architecture business of hers must be profitable. My mother laughed bitterly, and the sound felt like glass breaking in my chest. Profitable? Yes. But at what cost? She works all the time, has no husband, no children, no real connections to her community. She speaks English better than Spanish now, lives in that sterile apartment with no soul, drives around in her little car like she's too good for family gatherings. Victoria, on the other hand, has never lost touch with who she is. She still sleeps under the same roof where she was raised, still helps in the restaurant, still creates beauty in the world instead of just buildings. The conversation continued, but I had stopped listening. 8 years of secret financial support, hundreds of thousands of dollars of my own money, countless sleepless nights worrying about their bills and their future. All of it dismissed as meaningless because I had chosen a practical career over artistic pursuits. They saw my success as evidence of my spiritual poverty, my independence as proof of my selfishness, my financial stability as a sign that I had sold my soul to American materialism. The daughter who had sacrificed her own financial security to preserve their dreams was being criticized for caring too much about money. The irony was so sharp it took my breath away. I stood there in the shadow of the kitchen door, watching Victoria hold court in the dining room while my parents disparaged me in the back office, and something fundamental shifted inside me. For 8 years, I had been operating under the delusion that my financial support would eventually earn me their respect and gratitude. I had convinced myself that once they saw how successful I was, how capable I was of taking care of the family, they would finally appreciate me for who I really was. But the truth was much simpler and much more painful. They would never see me as anything other than the daughter who had chosen wrong. No amount of money, no level of success, no degree of sacrifice would ever change their fundamental assessment of my character. The anniversary celebration continued around me, but I felt like I was watching it through glass. Guests continued to praise Victoria's artwork. My parents continued to bask in the glow of their 25-year achievement, and I continued to smile and nod while my heart was breaking. Every congratulations felt like a mockery. Every compliment about the restaurant's success felt like a slap in the face. Every toast to the family's bright future felt like a betrayal. I had been living a lie for 8 years, pretending that my family's happiness was worth my own financial sacrifice. But what I had really been doing was enabling their delusion that they were successful through their own merit, while simultaneously allowing them to maintain their comfortable fiction that I was the family disappointment. Chapter 3: The Architecture of Revenge. The morning after the anniversary celebration, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. As I sat in my modest kitchen, drinking coffee from a mug I'd bought at a thrift store because I couldn't afford nice things anymore, I made a decision that would change everything. I opened my laptop and began methodically reviewing every fake contract, every fictional consultation agreement, every made-up investor relationship that I had created to support Casa Rodriguez. The architecture of my deception was impressive in its complexity. Shell companies with believable names, consultation fees that seemed reasonable, investment agreements that looked professionally drafted. I had built an entire financial ecosystem designed to funnel money to my family while preserving their pride. Now it was time to demolish it, brick by brick. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "Thank you for coming last night, mija. Victoria's art was beautiful, wasn't it? The restaurant looked perfect. We are so blessed by God's grace." I stared at the message for a long time. feeling the familiar mix of love and resentment that had defined our relationship for so long. God's grace. That's what she called the mysterious financial support that had kept their business alive. Not hard work, not business acumen, not the sacrifices of a daughter who loved them enough to bankrupt herself for their dreams. Divine intervention was apparently more believable than the possibility that the family disappointment might be their secret benefactor. I didn't respond to the text. Instead, I started making phone calls. The first call was to my business partner, Marcus, who had helped me create several of the shell companies that had been investing in Casa Rodriguez. Marcus was one of the few people who knew the full extent of my financial support for the restaurant, and he had been warning me for years that I was destroying my own financial future for people who didn't appreciate the sacrifice. "Are you sure about this, Elena?" he asked when I explained my plan to dissolve all the fake entities and cancel all the fictional contracts. Once you pull this support, there's no going back. The restaurant will probably fail within 6 months. I told him I was sure. In fact, I had never been more certain of anything in my life. The next series of calls were to various banks, legal entities, and financial institutions that had been facilitating my elaborate charade. I canceled automatic transfers, dissolved investment accounts, and terminated contracts that had been generating thousands of dollars in monthly support for Casa Rodriguez. Each phone call felt like cutting a rope that had been strangling me for years. With every canceled agreement, I felt lighter, freer, more like myself than I had in almost a decade. By the end of the day, I had eliminated every trace of the financial support system that had been propping up my family's business. From this moment forward, Casa Rodriguez would have to survive on its actual merit, not on my secret charity. The third phase of my plan involved something more complex. I needed to create a paper trail that would eventually lead my parents to the truth about their mysterious benefactors, but not immediately. I wanted them to experience the gradual failure of their business, to feel the panic and desperation that I had been shielding them from for years, before they discovered that their financial guardian angel had been the daughter they had dismissed as soulless and materialistic. I spent the weekend creating a series of documents that would be delivered to them over the coming months: termination letters from fake investors, cancellation notices from fictional consulting contracts, legal documents dissolving the shell companies that had been supporting them. I also began the process of reclaiming my own financial life. For 8 years, I had been living like a struggling graduate student while funding my family's comfortable lifestyle. I looked at my bank statements with fresh eyes and realized that without the monthly drain of Casa Rodriguez's hidden expenses, I could afford to live like the successful professional I actually was. I started shopping for a real house, looked into expanding my architecture firm, and even booked a vacation to Italy, something I had been postponing for years because I couldn't afford to travel while supporting the restaurant. For the first time in nearly a decade, I was making financial decisions based on my own needs and desires rather than my family's expectations. The psychological aspect of this transformation was even more significant than the financial one. I had been carrying the weight of my family's financial security for so long that I had forgotten what it felt like to be responsible only for myself. The constant anxiety about their bills, their lease payments, their equipment repairs, their employee salaries, all of that stress had been weighing on me like a physical burden. Now, suddenly, I felt like I could breathe again. Their financial problems were no longer my problems. Their business failures were no longer my responsibility to fix. Their inability to manage money was no longer my crisis to solve through creative accounting and financial sleight of hand. But perhaps the most liberating aspect of my decision was the end of the cognitive dissonance that had been tearing me apart. For 8 years, I had been living a double life. Publicly, the family disappointment who cared too much about money. Privately, the family savior who was sacrificing everything for their dreams. The gap between who I really was and who they thought I was had been growing wider every year, creating a psychological strain that had been affecting every aspect of my life. Now, finally, I could stop pretending. I could stop hiding my generosity behind fake contracts and shell companies. I could stop accepting their criticism while secretly funding their lifestyle. The truth would eventually come out, and when it did, they would have to confront the reality of who I really was versus who they had convinced themselves I was. Chapter 4. The Crumbling Empire. 3 months after I had systematically dismantled their hidden financial support system, the first cracks began to show at Casa Rodriguez. My mother called me on a Tuesday morning, her voice tight with worry that she was trying to disguise as casual concern. Elena, Mija, we're having some trouble with one of our investors. You work with business people. Do you know why someone would suddenly cancel a contract for no reason? I felt a dark satisfaction as I listened to her explain how their mysterious benefactor had sent a formal termination letter, ending a consultation agreement that had been providing them with $3,000 a month. It's so strange, she continued. They said their priorities had changed and they were focusing on other projects, but we had such a good relationship with them. The calls became more frequent as the weeks passed. Equipment started breaking down without magical repair funds appearing. Suppliers began demanding payment up front instead of extending their usual generous credit terms. The expensive wine inventory that never seemed to run out suddenly needed to be replenished with actual money. Most tellingly, the lucky breaks that had been sustaining them for years simply stopped happening. There were no more anonymous donations, no more mysterious grants, no more convenient windfalls that arrived just when they needed them most. For the first time in 8 years, Casa Rodriguez was operating as an actual business rather than as the beneficiary of my elaborate financial charity network. Victoria, who had never paid attention to the business side of the restaurant, began to notice that her parents seemed stressed and worried all the time. She started asking questions about money, a topic that had never concerned her before, because money had never been a real problem in their household. Why are Mom and Dad so worried about bills? She asked me during one of our increasingly rare family dinners. They keep talking about cash flow and investor problems. I thought the restaurant was doing well. I told her that the restaurant business was always challenging, that ups and downs were normal, that their concerns were probably temporary. The lie came easily, but it tasted bitter in my mouth. My parents began reaching out to me more frequently, asking for business advice and financial guidance. The irony wasn't lost on me. The daughter they had criticized for being too focused on money was suddenly the person they turned to when money became a problem. Elena, you understand these things, my father would say. What do you think we should do about this investor situation? How do we find new sources of funding? I would offer generic advice about business planning and financial management, all while knowing that the solution to their problems was sitting right in front of them. But I had made my decision, and I wasn't going to rescue them again. The most difficult part of watching their financial empire crumble was seeing the genuine confusion and fear in their eyes. They had never really understood how their business had survived for so many years, so they had no framework for understanding why it was suddenly failing. In their minds, they had been blessed with good fortune for 8 years, and now that blessing had been mysteriously withdrawn. They looked for explanations in everything except the truth: bad luck, economic downturns, changing neighborhood demographics, increased competition. The possibility that their success had been artificially sustained by someone they had dismissed as materialistic and soulless never occurred to them. By month 4, they were behind on rent and scrambling to make payroll. The stress was taking a visible toll on both of them. My father had developed a nervous tic, and my mother had started losing weight from worry and sleepless nights. Victoria finally understood the gravity of the situation and began pressuring me to help them financially. "You have a successful business," she said during a particularly tense family dinner. "Surely you could loan them some money to get through this rough patch. It's what family does for each other." I looked at her. This woman who had never worked a day in her life, who had never contributed a penny to the household expenses, who had spent 35 years living off our parents' generosity. And I almost laughed at the audacity of her suggestion. Instead, I told her the truth that I had been holding back for months. "Victoria," I said, my voice steady and calm. "I have been helping them. For 8 years, I've been secretly funding this restaurant through fake contracts and shell companies. Every lucky break they've had, every mysterious investor, every anonymous donation, that was me. I've spent hundreds of thousands of dollars of my own money keeping this place afloat while listening to you and our parents criticize me for being too materialistic and not caring enough about family." The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria stared at me with her mouth open, clearly struggling to process what I had just told her. My parents, who had overheard from the kitchen, emerged looking pale and shaken. The confrontation that followed was everything I had imagined and nothing like I had expected. There were tears, accusations, denials, and attempts at emotional manipulation. My mother cried and asked how I could be so cruel as to withdraw my support without warning them. My father demanded to know why I had hidden my help instead of being honest about it. Victoria accused me of playing God with their lives, of setting them up for failure just to prove a point. But through all of their emotional outpouring, not one of them apologized for the years of criticism, the constant implications that I was somehow deficient compared to Victoria, the casual dismissal of my character and values. Even faced with undeniable proof of my sacrifice and generosity, they couldn't bring themselves to acknowledge that they had been wrong about me. Chapter 5. The Foundation of Truth. 6 months after I stopped funding Casa Rodriguez, the restaurant closed permanently. My parents couldn't make the rent, couldn't pay their suppliers, and couldn't maintain the illusion of success that had defined their business for so many years. The closure wasn't dramatic. There was no final night celebration, no tearful goodbye to loyal customers. They simply locked the doors one Wednesday morning and posted a small sign thanking the community for 25 years of support. Victoria moved out of the apartment above the restaurant and, for the first time in her adult life, had to find a real job. She ended up working as a server at a chain restaurant in the suburbs, finally learning what it meant to exchange time and effort for money. The aftermath of the revelation had been messy and painful for everyone involved. My parents went through the predictable stages of grief: denial that I had really been their secret benefactor, anger that I had deceived them, bargaining for me to resume my support, depression when they realized their business was truly finished, and finally a grudging acceptance of the reality they had been avoiding for years. The acceptance phase was the hardest for me to witness, because it forced them to confront not just their financial dependence on me, but their fundamental misunderstanding of who I was as a person. The daughter they had dismissed as materialistic and selfish had been their salvation for 8 years, while the daughter they had praised as pure and artistic had contributed nothing to the family's survival. My relationship with my family didn't end, but it was permanently transformed. We began seeing each other for who we really were, stripped of the comfortable fictions that had sustained our dysfunction for so long. My parents were forced to acknowledge that their business had failed not because of bad luck or changing circumstances, but because they were poor managers who had been propped up by my hidden charity. Victoria had to confront the reality that her artistic lifestyle had been subsidized by the sister she had always looked down upon. And I had to accept that my family's love had always been conditional on my willingness to support them while accepting their criticism and dismissal. The process of rebuilding our relationships was slow and sometimes painful, but it was also more honest than anything we had shared before. My parents eventually apologized for their years of dismissive comments and their failure to appreciate my sacrifices. Victoria apologized for her entitlement and her assumption that she deserved support without contributing anything in return. I apologized for my deception, for creating an elaborate lie that had prevented them from understanding their true financial situation. We all apologized for the roles we had played in maintaining a family dynamic that was ultimately destructive for everyone involved. But the most important transformation was in how I saw myself. For 40 years, I had been seeking my family's approval and acceptance, even when that approval required me to diminish myself and hide my successes. I had been so desperate to be loved that I was willing to bankrupt myself financially and emotionally for people who saw my generosity as evidence of my spiritual poverty. The experience of watching them struggle without my support, and then watching them react to the truth about my sacrifice, had finally freed me from the need for their validation. I realized that I had been enough all along, successful enough, generous enough, loving enough, regardless of whether they could see it or not. With the financial burden of supporting Casa Rodriguez removed from my life, I was able to pursue goals I had been postponing for years. I expanded my architecture firm, bought a beautiful house in Cherry Creek, and started traveling internationally for both business and pleasure. More importantly, I began forming relationships with people who appreciated me for who I actually was, rather than who they thought I should be. I joined professional organizations, became involved in historic preservation projects, and even started dating again, something I hadn't had time or money for during my years of secret family support. Victoria and I eventually developed a real friendship, perhaps for the first time in our adult lives. Working in the service industry had given her a new perspective on the value of honest work and financial independence. She continued creating art, but now she did it in her spare time while supporting herself through her own efforts. Our parents struggled more with the transition, but they eventually found peace in a simpler lifestyle that matched their actual means rather than their inflated expectations. They moved to a smaller apartment, took part-time jobs, and learned to live within their real budget rather than the artificial one I had been providing. The experience taught me that love without honesty is just manipulation, and that family bonds built on lies and financial dependence aren't really family bonds at all. Real relationships require people to see and accept each other as they truly are, not as they wish they were or think they should be. For 8 years, I had been enabling my family's delusions about themselves and about me, thinking that my sacrifice would eventually earn me their respect and love. But what I learned was that respect and love can't be bought or earned through sacrifice. They can only be given freely by people who truly know and appreciate who you are. The daughter who was willing to hide her generosity behind fake contracts and shell companies was the same daughter who had the strength to withdraw that support when it became clear that it was doing more harm than good. Both decisions came from love, but only the second one came from self-respect.